The pandemic on the way, and by the time we were finished, they were trying to test it on.
I love that silence descended. So thank you very much. So yeah, Saturday night, so you'd all be in the basement of the record shop in Dún Laoghaire, as you do. It's not the first time I was in the basement of a record shop in Dún Laoghaire on a Saturday night, because my first ever job in the music industry was working in a record shop down on the main street called Exiles, run by two hippies, Don and Dave. And I was just there so often that I think they thought I worked there. And then they gave me the keys to the shop one day. And I was able to put on the records. I was able to play The Damned and Talking Heads. So that was my happy job until it went into receivership. But it wasn't because of the hippies, and it wasn't because of me. It was that in the 1980s, it was very hard to get records. We got 3 copies, I remember, the Cure single, Primary, and we wanted 20, but the major labels didn't know the audience in. That's just going to keep doing that, isn't it? The major labels.
Do you want me to tape it up just
my honey hasn't kicked in. Yeah, the major labels in Ireland, even as late as 1980, 81, 82, 83. You know what? Can I just hold it?
shoulders.
Yeah, there.
Yeah.
They just didn't. They weren't able to cater for the Irish audience for the records that we wanted. Rough Trade had no distribution in Ireland at the time, in Southern Ireland, and if you meet anyone who has records from that era, from kind of 78 through 84, and they've got really good records, now this is going to be sad for some of you, just give them a sniff. Seriously, if you're in their house and they've got a Cure record or Madness record, not Madness, but if they've a Cure record, anything on Rough Trade, the Fall, just give them a little sniff. And they smell like poo. No, this is good for collectors. Yeah, this is for you, the record collectors. And it's because they were smuggled from Belfast. So people from here went up to Belfast on the train and bought records from Terry Hooley in Good Vibrations and Caroline Records, because it was not possible to import those records to Ireland. So we'd a really high VAT rate, so it was very, very hard and expensive to collect music in Ireland. And for any of you who lived through the 80s, we were a poverty-stricken country. Very, very low per capita income compared to other European countries. So they were smuggled down. You unscrewed the cistern on the CIE toilet, and then you put in your records and you took them out in Dublin. But they do have a little sniff. So that's my record shop day little ad for collecting vinyl. But last night, it's lovely that you're all here. And last night, Niall and myself, we had we're thinking about what's going on here, and we talked then today briefly on the phone, and we literally cannot believe that the 3 people who are here to speak are here. So it means a lot to us. It's not something we take for granted. We're incredibly appreciative that you came to Dublin, to Dún Laoghaire, and you, all 3 of you, have inspired us in what we do, so that means a lot to us. The format for tonight is we're going to have a chat with Kevin Dunn first about his brand new book on stiff little fingers, on inflammable material, pivotal Irish record and pivotal punk record, and then we'll have a little break where you can go up and play Dungeons and Dragons for 7 minutes. And then we'll come back with John and Boff, who will be interviewed together, because there'll be some crossover between the conversations and their experiences. Some of you know me, and my interview style is that I like to project that you could do a much better job than I can. So shout questions anytime, like don't hold back. You'll probably never be in a room with these three people again, so seriously, if there's something you want to ask, just jump in. You know, if you've, I don't know where you're brought up, but if you've got a bit of social game, put up your hand, but if you don't, just shout out, you know, anything you want to know. So it's your night as well as ours. Kevin, this book, I've read a load of that Bloomsbury series of 33 1/3. Some of them are amongst the worst books on music that I've seen. But 3/4 of them are essential works that help to explain culture. I know it's an incredibly difficult process, and I was wondering, how on earth how did this end up in your lap? And then I went digging, and you're a serious academic with a large number
Not that serious.
Compared to
My
what's
records smell like poo.
Yeah,
so.
well then, that makes you more serious. But Africa, you know, it is your academic background, and you know, from the work that you've researched and published and written about and lectured about, you know, it's very clear that whatever part of you feels kinship with punk rock isn't just about, I like hardcore music and I want to jump around. It's coming from a sense that the world could be a better place. So how did you get into punk in the first place, and what's your background in terms of your music passion?
Yeah, okay, well, thank you. I'll try and keep this short, right? So I grew up in the United States, right? That is an American accent you're hearing. I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, which is a very conservative, racist southern town. I responded, not violently, but I negatively to those inputs, right? And so in the early 80s, I think when punk suddenly, all at once, right? So I had a couple of friends who came back from London with a whole bunch of new records, right? So it was the Clash, it was the Sex Pistols, there was some Exploited in there, some GBH. And so I was introduced to, and then also it was the 81, 82, so like Adam and the Ants and everything else was mixed in there. So everything hit at once. So punk spoke to me, and that kind of anti-status quo feeling that I had. So I didn't have the language yet to understand why punk resonated with me, but that did launch, 82, 83, a lifetime where punk rock ruined my life, right? It went down that path, right? Also ruined my wardrobe, right? It just, bleeding at shows all over my clothes and stuff. But yeah, and I was also fortunate enough because Jacksonville's off the beaten path. And so there was a group of kids who were a little bit older than me in high school who formed a band called Stevie Stiletto. And they kind of were practicing DIY punk, releasing their own records, making their own shows, all those things. And so I got to see it firsthand, which was amazing. But then they turned their practice space into a venue. So I got to see suddenly Black Flag or Sonic Youth passing through town in Jacksonville, Florida, on their way to, say, Miami or somewhere else. And so I just really quickly got to all this exposure that was life-forming, right? And so, again, I kept that going all through my life, obviously.
Okay, so you're touched by the hand of punk,
yeah,
and you see your local scene, which is DIY practice, so you're exposed to that. And then where does that dovetail with your academic path?
Yeah, so then I went off to college, and the anti-racism thing is really important because this is the 1980s. I'm very active in anti-apartheid movements. I go to college, I'm very active there. I take a class on African politics because I think I know a lot. And the professor says, no one here in this room knows enough to have a conversation with me. I was like, screw you. I mean, he was right. But then I was like, I need to learn as much as I can about Africa. And so that became a new passion and interest. And the kind of short story version of it is, I then went on to study international relations, African politics, and started to develop a career doing that. At the same time, I'm still playing in punk bands, I'm still running a punk label, I'm still putting out punk zines, I'm organizing punk shows, and they're two separate parts of my life. But then when my second child is born, I'm finding myself in the north of Uganda in a conflict zone with a Lord's Resistance Army. And I think to myself, and my partner says, what the hell are you doing, right? Why are you in a war zone? You need to be here with, and I'm like, what am I doing, right? But at that point, I had spent decades at that point, at least a decade and a half, establishing myself as an academic, which meant that I've been traveling the world. And wherever I would go, whether I was going to give a talk in Amsterdam or wherever in the world, I would go someplace and I would go figure out, okay, where's the local punk show, where's the local punk community, and I would go to punk shows and I'd be interviewing people, just hanging out and talking. And so when I realized I needed to pivot away from being in conflict zones, I was like, well, what can I write on? I have all this stuff on, and all these connections with punks across America, across Europe, across Africa, South Africa, Indonesia. So then I started writing about punk in a scholarly way, and in 2016 I wrote this book called Global Punk. So it goes like Africa, 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 and then there's a book on global punk. So then they become parallel, where I'm writing scholarship on Africa and kind of world politics, and then scholarship on punk. They kind of feed each other.
Yeah, and Global Punk is a really important book because, it was the first serious attempt to look at different countries. Punk didn't develop the same in any two cities. And the great thing about punk is you didn't have to be in a band to be part of the scene. You could be a writer. It could inspire you to be part of a fanzine. So can you tell us more about your fanzine and that self-publication and maybe fanzines that we've heard of over here that you get involved in?
Yeah, so I have been in punk bands, but I'm not good, right? None of my punk bands are good. I sing and I play bass, but I'm not good, right? But I can write fairly well, and so I've been doing zines and part of the zine world. And that was the one thing, I think this is true for most people who have a kind of engagement with punk, is it gets centered around the music a lot in the bands, but there's a huge infrastructure that's feeding to that, right? The collectives, right? The record stores, the independent record stores and bookstores, the venues that are being kind of supporting the whole scene, right? And so that's really important, right? I don't think about punk as a form of music. I think about punk as a set of social practices that are informed by a whole set of values. And so I've been writing and working with zines in the States. The big one that I write for is Razor Cake out of LA. And they're just absolutely fantastic people. And they're still going, right? At a time where major magazines keep folding and folding because they are DIY, nonprofit, and their ethos just goes all the way to their core in everything that they do. They're surviving, right? They're making it work.
Okay, and that's really interesting about taking a capitalistic way of making culture, but doing it with values. And there's someone here who's the editor of my favorite fanzine, that currently Ride 77, which I think is stellar. So will you talk a little bit more about Razor Cake and its values and what it represents to you, and how did you come across them?
Yeah, so the expression that I use, and I put it in my Global Punk, is that the people who seriously run big zines or independent record labels, like the Ian MacKays of Discord Records, right? They're intentionally bad capitalists, right? So they're capitalists because they have to be, because we live in a capitalist system. But they're intentionally bad in that they're not driven by a desire for profit maximization. They're driven by a desire a labor of love, and to create something, create a community, create art, and to make it sustainable, right? If you're not a smart capitalist, you're going to go under, right? So like Ian MacKay of Discord and Todd Taylor of Razorcake, they figured out how they can sustain within a capitalist system, but with those core values, right? You know, they treat everybody with the utmost respect, right? Everybody, right? If it's just the person, you know, coming in volunteering to sort through the mail, right? They are treated with the utmost respect. The postal workers, you know, who are taking the huge bundles, whether it's records or magazines, right? Yeah, seeing the value of each other's humanity, I think, is one of the driving forces to those kind of intentionally bad capitalist groups that are out there. So.
You know, and that's very inspiring, because it can be done in any cultural field or any way of social organization. Which brings us to an album that's so important to probably most of the people in this room. And where did you come across Stiff Little Fingers? Now, I'm asking this question because I haven't read the book. It just arrived, like
this
recently.
week,
And you know, what did we know in Dublin and Dún Laoghaire about Stiff Little Fingers? That they were fantastic, that they were on Rough Trade, that they had this profit share with Rough Trade. It was the first album on Rough Trade, which was a huge source of pride for us. It felt that we were part of the DIY conversation. And then there was the great story that English record labels wouldn't sign them because they got a cassette that looked like a bomb, and they were all scared. So
not a true story. One of the many fabricated stories of the band.
Which is why I thought I'd bring it up. So tell us more about that story, the myth, but where did you come across? Did you like them? Did you know about them?
So again, I'm a teenager in the United States, and so getting the kind of UK music, you know, all at once, right? In that was the Stiff Little Fingers, right? So Suspect Device, Alternative Ulster, you know, those are the two big ones, right? Their cover of Rita Marley's Johnny Was early on, because I was into reggae at the time as well, and so this is an early punk reggae cover, which was written by Rita Marley, not Bob Marley. I always have to say that, right, for the ladies, because it's true. But for me as a teenager, I had to go and try and figure out what they were talking about, right? So Alternative Ulster opens up with reference to Tridents and Bangor, and I'm like, oh, it's Trident nuclear submarine up there. It's not. It's right. It's the pub. And if you miss the train, you have to walk all the way back to Belfast, right? The pound is old. It's a pity, right? And I was like, is that the British currency? No, it's another pub. And so, part of that was decoding it, but part of that was also just like, no, I get it, right? The Suspect Device and Alternative Ulster, the core of this is to question everything, especially in the context of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And I was raised, my mother is English, so I'm well versed as a teenager in British and Irish history, which may be kind of special. But no scandalous, right? The Stiff Little Fingers are not my favorite band, right? They actually don't even rank probably in the top 50 of my favorite bands, which I know is quite scandalous. What I found fascinating was the Belfast punk scene. So when I wrote that book, The Global Punk, 10 years ago, there's like 2 or 3 pages about the Belfast punk scene. And I knew at the time I was just scratching the surface, because there's a really important story to tell about how consequential the Belfast punk scene was, right? We got New York, we got London, we got Belfast, right? And Belfast, like, the scene was consequential, I use that term intentionally, because it had consequences for the people who were involved in it. And then that scene, and the scenes that emerged there, made consequences for Belfast and Northern Ireland, right? This was an important scene. So I was lucky enough I get to go bounce back and forth between the United States and Galway. So I'm in Galway right now. And so the past 10, 12 years, I've been going to Belfast interviewing people in Belfast involved in the scene, not just that first wave from the 1970s, but also the 80s and 90s, which I think is really important because if the Stiff Little Fingers are talking about imagining an alternative Ulster, it's the anarcho-punks of the War Zone collective in the 80s and 90s that actually start putting it into practice, right? So there's a larger story there. And so when I pitched the book to Bloomsbury 33 1/3, I was like, I want to talk about inflammable material because this is the first independent record to chart in the UK, so it's historic, right? It's a product of, but also a response to the Troubles. So it's really important. It lands on people's top 10, top 100 list of punk albums of all time. So I want to tell that story. I want to tell the story of the band because they have a really complicated relationship with Belfast punk, which I hope I can talk a little about. But really, I want to talk about Belfast punk, right? So the book is about the album. It's about the band. The larger frame is what's happening in Belfast with punk. That's how I got to that book. Yeah.
Okay, and it's really not in your top 50.
Well, it might be in my top 50. It might be in my...
It either is or it isn't.
We'll come 51.
Back. Yeah,
51.
Yes.
How's that?
So from the top 51. Now we'll come back to that because I find that very interesting. So no one's read the book. What's in the book then? Like what stood out for you? What surprised you when you were doing the research? Was it a different book when you proposed it than the one that you then said, I'm done, this is the book?
So I pitched it 2 years ago, and I knew exactly what it was going to be, right? So when I sent the pitch in, I was like, this is how it's going to go, and this is my argument. Here's a sample chapter because I've already been writing about Belfast punk for a while. So in my mind, I knew what it was going to be, and part of what it is that young kid listening to Alternative Ulster, Suspect Device, getting really excited and thinking of this voice of Belfast punk, because it is, right? I mean, Alternative Ulster, people talk about this as like the informal national anthem of Northern Ireland, right? It's hugely important. And then I started doing my research. I was like, oh, this band's relationship to the scene is really, really complicated, right? So just three quick examples. Suspect Device, their first single, right? It's the first song because they were a hard rock cover band. And then they recorded Suspect Device. They didn't write it. If you don't know the story, it was written by an English journalist, which a lot of people in Belfast found really problematic, that here's this song about, and it says, we're gonna blow up in your face, the youth of Belfast. It's like, it's written by an English journalist. The second point is that English journalist becomes their manager, and then promoting the band is selling the band as a mixed band, right? So half Catholic, half Protestant, which I believe Wikipedia still has that listed as of a couple of weeks ago. That is another fabrication. All four of the original band members from the same school, from the same neighborhood. So in Belfast, that meant they're from the same kind of background, right? They're all Protestant kids, right? They don't see themselves as actors, but that's their background. And it doesn't matter that they're not mixed, right? But for the people in Belfast who knew them, like, what the fuck are you doing? We know who you are. Why are you trying to pass yourselves off as a mixed band when you're not? It doesn't matter that you're mixed or not, but it does matter that you're passing but to their credit, right, the band, that was a management's kind of move, right? And some of the members of the band had a real strong problem with that, right? Some of them don't, and one of them continues to produce that myth. So that's interesting, right? So the people in Belfast, like, within the punk scene are like, they're important. One of the three original bands in Belfast punk, right? Rudy, The Outcast, and Stiff Little Fingers. But there's serious competition between the three of them, which I didn't know about until I started doing the research. And that the Stiff Little Fingers had this really significant baggage. And the third point is is, they kind of known and are being sold as the kind of voice of Belfast youth, which they're an important voice. Like, I'm not going to take the book, like, sings their praises enormously. But by the time the album, even before the album comes out, they've moved to London, and they're trying to get a major record label deal. So again, people in Belfast are like, yeah, we have some problems, right? So it's really interesting that relationship back then with the band and the scene, and how that is even today.
With any act, but particularly with a band in Belfast at that moment in our history. But to go back to the myth about the cassette tape looking like a suspect device.
No.
So was that a part of the fabrication?
That was a part of it, yeah. So that, again, the management put that out there and let it circulate. And again, some of the members of the band were very uncomfortable with that. But they're teenagers, and they're having this opportunity, so they're like, okay, we'll go along with it. I mean, these are really young kids. But yeah, it was the management's creation, and they were being, again, sold to a UK audience, and then eventually an American audience, but to a British audience, as kind of this band that's speaking to the Troubles and kind of bridging across the barricades and being the voice of the youth. And then the youth back in Belfast are like, what the fuck are you talking about, right? So a lot of the bands back then that are emerging had that kind of tension with Stiff Little Fingers, which also is driven by jealousy, right? Because those guys are not being courted by Rough Trade or anybody else. Terry Hooley's putting out records, very important, but Stiff Little Fingers didn't want to be on Terry Hooley's because that was too small, right? So they had bigger aspirations, which caused some tension as well.
That's really interesting. But can the words inflammable material today lead to a bit of confusion? You told me something about the books getting delivered.
Sure. So that is not a true story about the cassette tape being dumped by the record label in a bucket of water because they thought it was a bomb. That's not true. But because of the complicated reasons, thank you Brexit, about getting books shipped to me in Galway, I had to get them shipped to my colleague at Queen's University, Belfast, and when they got there, they'd actually messed up the shipping label, so my name nor her name was on there. It went to the Department of Politics, but they didn't know who it was for. They opened it up, they saw a bunch of books that said inflammable material, and they sent it to the physics department. And where it sat for several weeks until my friend I had a book event launch in Belfast on Thursday, and they did not find it until Wednesday afternoon. So I was like going to Belfast, like, I got no books to show off, but it worked out fine.
It's an incredible album.
It is.
It's still incredible. It was sensational at the time. The way it made us feel in the South, because there was a bit of distance. We deliberately put a bit of distance between ourselves and the North because it was quite uncomfortable to take positions at times, but they were bands that were absolutely loved here and embraced, and punk was different in every single city that it landed in. But you mentioned a point about the band being uncomfortable, and a lot of the bands that were labelled punk at that time, they were incredibly young, and things happened incredibly quickly. They were very, very prolific. They were very busy. They were seeing lots of things that they were being asked to shoulder a lot of ideological baggage. Is there a song apart from the two singles? Where do you go into that album to find things that are interesting or that make a statement or that give you joy?
Before I answer that, I'm going to back up because you threw a couple of things out which I think are really important. One is just how young these kids were. Now, Stiff Little Fingers have been playing together as teenagers in a cover band where they'd have to play for hours. Right? So by the time they went in to record inflammable material, right, they had their chops. Right? They were really, really good, as opposed to the Outcasts, which was a Belfast punk band, the second one. who didn't know how to play when they decided to become a band, right? Three brothers thought Sex Pistols were amazing. Why couldn't they do it? They didn't have instruments, but they were going to do it anyway. So they were a little rough around the edges in many ways, and they're great, but they didn't have the musical chops that, say, the Stiff Little Fingers did. So when they came in, they were firing on all rockets. But interestingly, if you listen to the album, early recording, they didn't have any click track, so you can hear things speeding up and slowing down. There was no common tuning, so someone go, okay, are you sound like you're in tune? Let's tune to you. So much of the album is actually not in regular tuning, which is kind of cool. And the people who were actually on the other side recording it did not know what the hell they were doing, right? These are rough trade office workers who had no idea what they were doing, and they pulled it off. So the fact that it sounds as good, and it sounds great, is really amazing, right? It's amazing testament to the band and the power of the band. And also, I got really lucky because the people who were recording said, just play like you're playing live, and we'll throw up the mics as well as we can. Alternative Ulster is going to always hit with me, right? This is a song that it's just so powerful, right? As a response, and they did write Alternative Ulster, right? They didn't write Suspect Device, which is a great song itself. But Alternative Ulster, I think, speaks, I will say, Alternative Ulster speaks to the importance of standing up to authority in all its forms across the they were talking shit about all the paramilitaries up there, which was a ballsy thing to do. But Alternative Ulster speaks to that, about standing up to authority, to all the bullies, right, and grabbing, grabbing your future. You can make it happen. That kind of DIY ethos, self-empowerment. That is super, super important in the way I hear it. Jake Burns, who wrote it, said it's a song about being bored. He was just bored, and that's what the song is about. I think he's full of shit. He might have thought that's how he started when he started writing it, but that's not. You can't drop a line about the RUC dogs of, oppression barking at your feet. That's not about being bored, right? There's something else going on there. But yeah, he still says it's just about it being a bored teenager, but there's so much more.
And finally, we could go on, but
we have two way more important, interesting people to talk about.
No,
they can actually play their music.
It's a great bill. What's Stiff Little Fingers' legacy? Like, was it just that one album and then they were gone, or do they matter in history?
So that's a great question, right? So I think they'll always go down as an important, one of those really important early wave of punk, right? And especially in Ireland, whether it's Northern Ireland or just we're going to take the entire island, right? Really an important band. What I find fascinating, the book actually ends on this, is how the Stiff Little Fingers are remembered in Belfast today. So I'll give you two examples, right? There's where Good Vibrations, Terry Hooley's record store was. It's now a public mural that the city paid for, right? Because the city is doing a lot of cultural tourist promotion. So there's a building where his record store was. There's a big painting of him on the side, and then there's a whole thing in the front about Good Vibrations. And the only band listed on there, at the very top, it says Stiff Little Fingers, Alternative Ulster with a fire symbol there. They were never on Good Vibrations records, right? So, but yet, shorthand, that's Belfast punk, right? And every year there's a big day festival called Bring the Fast Back in Belfast. And the headlining act is always Stiff Little Fingers, and they bring in the Skids or the Damned or whoever to play along. So it's kind of a nostalgia night. But there's thousands of people. It's an outdoor event there in the city center. Thousands of people are showing up, and it's amazing. And it becomes that the Stiff, and there's at this point, I think Jake is the only original member. No, Ollie's back, but here's a band who has not lived and been in Belfast for decades and decades and decades. They fly in every year, and they're treated as hometown heroes because they are a cultural export for the city and for Northern Ireland, which I think resonates really deeply for the people because it speaks to both where they were in terms of the Troubles, but also moving past. And one of the most moving things that's ever happened to me is standing in the middle of thousands of people on that night when they're playing and having everybody sing Alternative Ulster together. It's pretty phenomenal.
And in American music, do you see any legacy from Stiff Little Fingers or?
Yeah, so Ian Templeton. If you have a Stiff Little Fingers story, Ian Templeton is writing a book about fan memories. So you can reach out to Ian Templeton. That's my plug for Ian. And he and I were talking, and it's amazing when you're coming across different bands who will reference Stiff Little Fingers as an influence, right? It's always significant, right? So, like Moby loves Stiff Little Fingers. Okay. But other band like Naked Ray Gun, which is a Chicago punk band, like it's deeply influenced by Stiff Little Fingers. It's always interesting to see how younger bands, new bands, will be influenced as well. So their legacy, I think, continues in really interesting ways. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to reading the book, but lovely to meet you, and thank you for being here, and give it up to Kevin Dunn.
Thank you. I have to say, it's been an absolute honor being here, right? Being invited and being part of this. So thank you so much.
Number 51.
Yes.